Please pray with me. Gracious God, may the meditations of my mouth and the meditations of all our hearts be a pleasing offering to you, O God, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. As I was reading up on these passages, I was thinking about how difficult they can come across. And I'm not the only one in that regard. One of the commentators that I was reading for this week likened the gospel passage to when she serves cooked spinach to her family. No matter how much she explains how good it is to them, they don't want to eat it. And this is one of those passages that we probably know on some level. It's good for us, but we don't really want to have to do it. It is not an easy text to preach. This is one of the hardest things about Christianity, to love those who hate you, to lend money to those who can't or won't repay, to provide for those who don't deserve it. Jesus even says to return nonviolence to those who are violent against you. This isn't the warm, fuzzy faith that we hear about from some preachers. And not only is it really hard to do, but it really comes across as not very prudent or wise instructions for living. If you follow Jesus' commands, you'll be a sucker, a loser even, who is taken advantage of by everybody else and end up penniless and maybe even dead. In fact, maybe I should just forget about this gospel reading and just talk about the resurrection of the dead again. How would you like that? I know you guys just loved that riveting sermon last week. On the other hand, you might say, well, no, Chris, I don't know what you're talking about, Chris. What Jesus says is great advice. I do it all the time. I always return good to those who hate me. I always give to those who can't repay, and I follow this all the time. I don't know what you're talking about. But as we read these texts, we are reminded of the power of love and the power of forgiveness. The Genesis reading for this morning tells us a portion of the Joseph Novella. Of course, it's just one tiny little scene from the whole story, so I'll give you a short little synopsis of the story in case you don't remember it. Joseph was the favorite son of the patriarch Jacob. Joseph had 10 older brothers, and he really rubbed it in their faces that he was daddy's special boy. By the way, there's a lesson there for parents. Don't have favorites, or at least make sure that the other kids don't find out that you have favorites. One of the two of those things. Needless to say, Joseph's older brothers hated him for this. Not only was he the favorite son, but he just couldn't help himself. He had to really make his brothers remind them of it. So in a moment of vulnerability, when it was just his brothers and him, and he was alone, his older brothers seized him, and they sold him into slavery. Of course, they couldn't just do that without consequences, so they had to make up a story. They told their father that Joseph was killed by a wild animal. Actually, they were a little bit more clever than that. They didn't want to lie, so they took their brother's cloak and they put animal blood on it and then just gave it to their father. And of course, he came to the conclusion that his son had been killed, which is exactly what they wanted him to do. They didn't actually lie, but let's be honest, they weren't really telling the truth either. Meanwhile, Joseph ends up a slave in Egypt. And through many trials and tribulations, which I don't have time to go into, but he ends up becoming second in command over Egypt, right under Pharaoh, the king. And then a great famine strikes the whole inhabited world. And only Egypt, because Joseph has carefully planned for this, has stored up enough food to feed everybody. So Jacob, back home, he and his sons and his extended family are in trouble. They don't have food. So he sends his 10 older sons down to Egypt to buy food. When they arrive to purchase food before Joseph immediately recognizes them. They don't, however, recognize him. Now, this is the part of the story that I always think is we kind of gloss over this, because we read the story today and we say, look at how he forgave his brothers. Yes, he did. But let's just be honest, he really tortured them for quite a while before he forgave them. He puts them through a series of tests, which are pretty awful, actually, where they think they are really in trouble, and their father is in grief, and they think their lives are in danger. So I guess the lesson is you can forgive only after you've made sure they really deserve it. I don't know what but that's not really the point here. He wanted to see if they had really changed. And eventually he decides that they have. And so this moment in the text today is when he finally reveals himself to his brothers. Now, he could have killed them. He could have used the power that he had, but instead he forgives them, and he shows them great love. Not only that, he reinterprets what happened to him as being the result of God's will. God intended his enslavement in order to create a way of life for others. Now, we have to be very careful with this kind of theology, because it is not unusual for powerful people to tell not powerful people that their suffering is part of a greater redemptive purpose. That's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about the person themselves suffering who decides that that is, in fact, what is happening here. It's not hard for a powerful person to tell someone else that they're suffering for a greater cause. And in fact, they might even be making them suffer. That's not what we're talking about here. Suffering ultimately can only be given meaning by those who are going through it. Somebody else who's not suffering should not presume to tell somebody else what their suffering should mean. But we can see from this text that Joseph's forgiveness of his brothers was necessary for God's plan to come about. Because if Joseph had not forgiven his brothers, Jacob and his sons would have died, and the promise would have ended. God's promise to Abraham that has been carried forward ever since would have come to an end. So God's plan required Joseph to be forgiving and loving. Both Joseph and his brothers have been transformed through their struggles. Joseph was no longer the bratty, arrogant brother, and they were no longer violent and hateful. In fact, they were willing to even sacrifice their well-being for their brothers. Love and forgiveness are the only way for the people to move forward. And the story of Joseph and his brothers reveals something key, that God's mission in this world requires us to live compassionately with forgiveness. So that's something to be thinking about as we approach the gospel reading. Because when Jesus is teaching here, of course, he's got Torah in the back of his mind. He's thinking about that. He's thinking about the commandments. He's thinking about all of these stories and traditions that have come before him. And he sets a very high bar. He says, don't just love your neighbor, but love your enemy. And of course, we know from later in the parable of the Good Samaritan, that Jesus eventually redefines neighbor to mean anyone we encounter who is in need. Jesus tells us it's easy to love those who love you. I don't know how many times I've met people who basically think it's apparently an act of great virtue to love their families. I'm like, but these are people that love you. Do you love people that don't love you? It's easy to lend to those who can pay you back. It's easy to show kindness to those who show kindness to you. Jesus is asking his followers to break out of that world of reciprocity. Thank you. This world where I do this and you do that. I do good, you do good. This sort of almost economic, transactional way of looking at goodness. That's not what Jesus wants us to do. Jesus wants us to realize that God, in God's great love and goodness, has overflowed love and goodness to us. And it's our job to then flow goodness and love around to more people. Now, to those of you who already say that you do this, I'm glad that you feel that things are going good with you. But are you really showing love to others in all the ways that you can? See, often we kind of think about love in terms of face-to-face personal relationships. And in that sense, it's not too hard to be nice and kind and loving to people that you run into in the day-to-day world. Oh, I'm in the store and somebody cuts in front of me, and instead of being angry, I show them compassion and love. Yeah, okay, good. That's a good thing. Or somebody cuts me off on Highway 14 as I'm coming. By the way, apparently speed limits are only recommended in Iowa. I didn't realize that. You know, my sister-in-law is from Illinois, and she always complained about in Spokane how everybody drives the speed limit. But I'm like, oh, I guess that's kind of a Midwestern thing. I'm going along at what I think is fast, 5 miles over the speed limit, and I'm like, whoa. So anyway, I digress. And now I've kind of forgot what I was even talking about. But, you know, when we interact in these one-on-one, interpersonal connections, it's easy. It's one way to think about love, right? And to be compassionate and kind. But the thing is that how we love also extends beyond our actual personal interactions. You know, we live in such an interconnected world that we express our love in other ways as well. For example, not only do we have that personal, but we also have a political role to play that is where we can express our love. We also have an economic way that we can express our love. Let me say a little bit about what I mean about that. Are we being loving in the political sphere, for example? Are we voting for causes that exemplify love, especially to those who are most vulnerable? Are we voting for candidates who exude that love that God requires all of us to have? Or are we just voting for our own self-interest? What do I mean when I talk about the economic sphere? Well, we live in a free market system. And believe it or not, how you spend your money is an even more important vote than the one at the ballot box. Because voting only occurs maybe once a year, but buying and selling is something that we do nearly every day. And that buying and selling determines the kind of world that we live in even more. Are we buying products that make the world a more loving place? Are we buying them from people who are making the world a more loving place? Are we not buying products that aren't making the world a better place? This is how we need to think about love. It's not just about me and my personal relationships with the people around me. Because we live in such an interconnected world, love has to express itself in bigger ways than that. So before we get too smug and say, hey, look at me, I'm so good, we have to look at all of the ways that we interrelate to the world, all of the interconnectedness, and how are we really being loving? Are we really being kind? Now, for those of you who are with me so far, you realize, well, yeah, Chris, you're right about all this. But how do we possibly live that out? How do we possibly reach that level? You know, in our old Reformed tradition, we would talk about something called total depravity. Anybody familiar with that term? Total depravity was the sense that our sinfulness just totally corrupts everything that we do. And we know that maybe that's a little extreme way of expressing, but we realize that it shows how limited we are as humans. We just can't quite reach that ideal. Well, the good news for us is that is where God's grace comes in. That's where God's grace and forgiveness enters into the equation. That's where other people's grace and forgiveness also comes into the equation. Because we can't always live up to that standard. We're going to fail. But at the same time, that doesn't mean we don't try. Now, some of you will say, well, Chris, how can we even do this? How could we ever even try to live up to this standard? Well, I'll refer you back to my earlier point, grace. But we also need to remember that God has given us numerous ways in our lives to strengthen our resolve. God may have given us people in our lives who are a challenge to us to love. When I was reading about this text, I heard this great quote. It's a terrible fact that we have so many opportunities to love our enemies. Yeah, it's a terrible fact that we have so many opportunities to love our enemies. We are surrounded by people, and sometimes we're going to have to practice loving our enemies. But at the same time, God has also given us other means of grace, not just put challenges in front of us. My mom was always worried that my sister and I prayed for patience for her, that God would send more children. She did end up with twins after that, so I don't know if that's what that says anything. But you know, we've all kind of been in that place where it's like, oh, I don't know if I want God to give me patience or something, because that means something is going to happen to make that happen. But God is a loving God. We don't have to freak out about that kind of thing. But we have the proclamation of the word, and we have the sacraments to help us. We have the spiritual practices like Bible study, like prayer, like book groups, like fellowship, contemplation to grow us in our faith. I always love it when people who rarely come to church tell you that they're not being fed. I'm like, really? Well, it's funny, I don't see you ever participating in any church things. Maybe that's why you're not being fed. So if we're having trouble with that loving part, what are we doing in our spiritual lives to strengthen that? Those of you who are into athletics know that you can't just one day decide to run a marathon or play in a basketball game. Well, you can, but you really will regret it later, right? And you're not going to really do very well. Well, spiritual life is the same way. It takes practice, it takes training, it takes discipline. These are the kinds of things we have to do to grow our muscles, so to speak, so that we can be those loving and compassionate people. And so that, I think, is the solution to this problem. This text is hard. It is not easy. It challenges us. And it doesn't just challenge us in the immediate family, group of interpersonal relationships. It challenges us in how we live in the world as a public person, economically and politically. But the good news is that when we fail, grace will be there for forgiveness, both from God and from others. And at the same time, God is always giving us instruments to grow our faith, to grow our ability to be those kinds of loving, compassionate people that God wants us to be. Because we remember from the Joseph story, God's plan for this world kind of requires us being loving and forgiving. This is a joint effort on our part with God. And without our participation, there cannot be that important healing and mending that must happen.